Today is Thursday, June 9th, 2022. This presentation is a part of a larger project documenting the history of certain buildings on the Health Sciences campus of the University of Utah. This project is a joint project between the University of Utah School of Medicine and the American West Center. This presentation is recorded in partial satisfaction of requirements from the Utah State Historic Preservation Office. This presentation will move through three different parts to help explain the history of what is today known as the MREB, or Medical Research and Education Building. The MREB was torn down beginning in November of 2021. This presentation begins in the 1940s with the acquisition of land from Fort Douglas, before moving through some of the financing and construction issues that were encountered. Finally, we'll cover some of the responses to the building and explain its value in light of the School of Medicine's history. So to begin, let's talk about the land from Fort Douglas. To talk about the land from Fort Douglas, we have to start with the War Assets Administration, or WAA. The WAA was established in 1946 after the end of World War II. The WAA was tasked with disposing of surplus consumer, capital, and producer goods, as well as industrial and maritime property, and airports and aircraft located in the United States. All of these materials were produced during World War II, and the United States had a lot of surplus to be unloaded on businesses and consumers. A whole array of items were sold. Businesses could get their hands on industrial chemicals that maybe they needed. Factories were sold to businessmen who promised to convert them. And again, keep in mind, we're in the process of moving from a wartime economy to a peacetime economy. So bullets to mayonnaise. You could get a prisoner of war camp. And if you were really lucky, as in the case of the University of Utah, a whole army fort might be declared surplus. Now, what was happening on the university campus at the time? Well, the university generally and the medical school acutely had two big problems. They have no space and they have no money. Now, the University of Utah had actually converted to a 4-year medical school program in 1944. As a part of that change, they began recruiting top-flight faculty from the East. Each of these faculty were recruited with the promise that at the end of the war, space would be constructed in support of their research. And of course, the faculty believed them and continue researching, all the while attracting grants. However, the buildings were a lot slower to come than the grant money. And so by 1947, we have a unique problem on the medical school. The amount of money that they are receiving in grants is too much. The university might potentially will have to decline future grant money. And this is what the current dean of the medical school at the time, Richard Young, warned. Researchers would have to decline future grants if buildings were not constructed for their work. Now, there was some good news in all of this. In 1947, Congress amended the 1944 Surplus Property Act. The amendment would give priority to city and state agencies above federal agencies when claiming land and property that the Army had declared as surplus. Under these terms, states and cities could acquire property for education, health, and health purposes at as much as a 100% discount. For a university, and again, specifically a medical school that has very little money and is so tight on space, this is a godsend. So when Fort Douglas is declared as surplus in 1948, the president of the University of Utah, Ray Olpen reaches out to the War Assets Administration saying that the university is very interested in acquiring the land that Fort Douglas, which sits just next to the university, currently has. Olpen files the application in June of 1948, and we confirm with the WAA that the buildings and land would potentially be 100% free, or at most 15% of their value. So either way, either pretty cheap or free. Fort Douglas is declared available for sale on September 15th, and we waste no time putting in an application. The WAA remarks that they, quote, have rarely seen such a complete job, and your office is to be congratulated after they received the University of Utah's application. So whatever we did, they liked it. Now, there is one snag in all of this. Aside from the land and buildings that would be used for a hospital, medical campus, and additional teaching buildings for the university would also be acquiring the Fort Douglas Golf Club. And we can see a couple of people out on the Fort Douglas Golf Club in this photo in 1946. Now, the reason that there's an issue with the Fort Douglas Golf Club being on this land that the university is seeking is that the amendment to that law that I mentioned specifies that the land and buildings are used for education and medical purposes. So what is the education or health benefit of a golf course? As you might be thinking, there really isn't one. Now, to help push our application through though, President Olpen enlists the Federal Security Agency, which is actually an office of the Department of Education, to support our application. And I'm gonna quote from their letter of support. Quote, President Olpen has stated that the university is in no way interested in operating a golf course, that they do not expect to make any money from a golf course, but that because of the danger of grass fires in this arid region and the proximity of many temporary frame buildings, the golf course grounds would become a fire menace if the grounds were not watered and cared for. Also, while being used for a golf course, this acreage is kept in beautiful condition, adding to the appearance of the university and the entire unit. So that's how we managed to get this application through. It's not that we want to operate a golf course, the university has to operate the golf course. Otherwise, we're going to be at a huge risk of wildfires. So it's really quite sensible to keep the 18-hole golf course in the center of what is supposed to be a medical school campus operating. And so the Federal Security Agency supports our application. And this ploy totally works. The university is able to secure the Fort Douglas land from the War Assets Administration. They accept our application and give us nearly 300 acres of Fort Douglas land, 61 buildings, and an additional 45 buildings. All of this for $7,951. That's a little over $91,000 in today's money. And we are looking at a photo of the resolution of the acceptance of our application and the confirmation of this contract with the WAA as it was recorded in the meeting minutes of the Board of Regents of the University of Utah. And the regents are thrilled. I've thrown a little bit of confetti on here so you know it's a celebration. They are congratulating each other with this resolution's passage. They thank the president for his leadership. They congratulate each other on their hard work in acquiring the Fort Douglas property. And they decide that such a monumental acquisition for the future of the university needs to be celebrated with everyone. And so the Board of Regents decides to make a real occasion of the celebration of the Fort Douglas lands. And so they elect to have the deed handed over from the War Assets Administration to the university administration at homecoming in 1949. So they invite the folks that they worked with from the WAA, they invite their wives, and on October 30th at the homecoming game, at halftime, they hand over the deed. And a regional council of the WAA, who actually oversaw this disposal, writing of the experience, said that, quote, of the 500 disposals he had taken care of, he had received more pleasure in handling the acquisition of the Fort Douglas property for the University of Utah than any of the others he had worked with, because of the special care and order which had been used in preparing the application. Now, I mentioned that this happened at homecoming. The students, in writing about homecoming in their yearbook, don't really remember, or don't at least remark on the fact that this major acquisition of university land happened. They're too focused on the singing and the football. It does surface later, and I'm sorry, I think I misspoke a couple of minutes ago. The handover happens in 1948. They do mention it later in the yearbook, so they're kind of aware it's happening. But like I said, not the focus of their homecoming festivities. Now that we've talked about the land, let's talk a little bit about the construction of the building, because of course, nothing is really easy with this building. So as you might imagine, there are a couple of snags here too. So in 1948, the University of Utah received a construction grant from the National Advisory Cancer Council, what is a part of the National Cancer Institute, or NCI. This grant awarded $416,000 to be used for the construction of a building where cancer research took place. Now, usually these are matching grants. And in fact, in 1951, the NCI would begin stipulating that all money is actually matching funds that they award, but that restriction had not yet come into place. This will be very important for the construction of the University of Utah's cancer building. So we get this grant in 1948. Now, what's interesting is that the School of Medicine takes this as an opportunity to plan long-term. And so they actually draft a much larger basic sciences building that has facilities for clinical research, basic science research, and clinical teaching. And the cancer research building will just be one wing of this much larger complex that's going to be that big promised home for all of these faculty. And so we get these plans drawn up by Ashtons, Evans, and Brazier, a local architecture firm. And again, the cancer research building that we just got funding for from NCI is one part of this building. We tell NCI that they know that it's just going to be one wing of a larger building. They say, okay, everyone has signed off on these plans. So that means everything can be built, no problem, right? And of course, wrong. The execution of this plan depended on the approval of the university's budget by the state legislature and governor. So the university plans on being able to do a good bit of building, not just this larger medical science research complex. And it passes the state legislature, but it gets vetoed by Governor J. Bracken Lee in 1949. Ultimately, 12% of the university's budget has to get cut somehow, because Lee has decided that the university already gets too much funding and he's not going to be a part of giving any more money. Now, Leo T. Samuels, one of the researchers at the university who had been recruited out here on the promise of more space, has some pretty amusing thoughts about Governor Lee. writing that he was a man who, quote, didn't see much reason to have a university education anyways. Samuels also chalks up his veto to a change from a Democratic to a Republican governor. And so this is Lee's reassertion as a small as a small government state. And so we see a little bit of that tension between the state legislature and the university, even here with this one building. Now, with that 12% budget cut, though, there's no way any construction is going to happen on the medical campus. And so President Ray Olpen has the misfortune of having to explain exactly what happened to NCI, who just gave us all of this money. And so this is actually a photo of his letter to R.G. Meter, who's the director of the grants branch, or chief of the cancer research grants branch. And so he explains, oh, I'm so sorry. Many apologies for not having earlier replied to your letter. And of course, the reason why is that there was all of this finagling, trying to figure out whether or not they'd be able to construct the rest of the building, whether there'd be any money available to support the construction of this current building, the cancer building, what would be done. And what's eventually decided by the University of Utah Medical School is that they just won't construct the rest of the basic science building and will proceed with the cancer building anyways and plan on being able to add to it when money does become available. And so as you see noted in this letter, Olpen says that, quote, the entire cost of the construction of the cancer building will have to be borne by the grant in aid for cancer research construction. And again, just 2 years later, this would not be possible because NCI does change their restrictions and does add restrictions on their grants and say, these are matching grants. You must put forth, the institution must put forth some amount of money to help support the construction of this building. Now, later in the letter, and I like to imagine that Olpen's really trying to soften the blow of this terrible news, he notes that, quote, we are proud to report that the building at the university will be erected on a beautiful piece of land adjoining the regular campus and is located in such a way that it will become an important part of the medical center, which is destined for that area. So he does promise that it will be important. And hopefully R.G. Meter is persuaded some. Now, with the financing handled, the construction actually does pass pretty smoothly. Here we can see an unfurnished laboratory that's in this building. So just a recap of what has happened so far. We get that land in 1948. The grant is received in 1948. The budget cuts happen in 1949. So that cancer wing gets, I guess, upgraded in a way to a discrete cancer research building. And construction begins pretty quickly afterwards, in February of 1950. And as I mentioned before, the architecture firm handling this is Ashton, Evans, and Brazier. The Brazier in question is B.E. Brazier. He had previously worked at Los Alamos National Laboratories, designing some small buildings as a part of the complex there. He will also be the lead architect of the eventual medical center that gets built on the University of Utah's campus, but not yet. We got to give it almost 10 more years before that happens. So, right, construction begins February of 1950. Now, in June of 1950, the Atomic Energy Commission, the AEC for short, writes to the university asking if they can fund an annex to attach to this building. And in this annex, there will be space for dog kennels because they want to begin a massive research project that uses beagles and sees the effects of radioisotopes on their health over the lifetime of the dogs. So this photo here actually shows the insides of some of these kennels that are attached to the cancer research building. And what's interesting about them is that the panels at the back of each of those little kennels slide up, so the dogs actually have an indoor-outdoor run. Now, construction on the cancer research building is complete in 1951. and construction on the annex finishes later that year. So as I said, those buildings get erected fairly easily, not too many issues. And here we're looking at another photo of the interior of the Cancer Research Building. And now we'll talk a little bit about the public response to that building. So here we see a photo from the opening ceremony for the Cancer Research Building. And you can see these men are standing behind that model that we saw earlier that shows this is just the beginning of what will be a large medical center project. So from left to right, this photo shows President Ray Olpen. Next to him is David Price, the Associate Director of the NIH, or National Institute of Health. Sterling Sill, who's a regent, is there in the middle. B.E. Brazier, the architect of the building, is to his right with the little bow tie. And Vivian Parley White, who is the Utah State Medical Association president and was a guest speaker at these ceremonies, is on the far right. And there is a real sense from President Olpen and Regent Sill that this is the beginning of what will become a great medical school. Or I guess it's already a great medical school, but will become a great unified site of medical research on campus. So Sterling Sill actually says exactly that in the newspaper. He says this will be a great medical center. And President Olpen says, quote, that an admirable job of designing and obtaining the most value for the money spent. That's what this building symbolizes for him. And remember, we had only that $416,000 from NCI, nothing else. So what type of work goes on in this building? Well, one of the interesting things is that it's actually shared use. Each department gets its own floor. So one floor is reserved for physiology, one for anatomy, and one for biochemistry. One of the things researchers were most excited about, if you look in the background of the middle picture and the picture on the right, and you also saw it in some earlier photos, is this tile. And those square tiles in real life are a sort of faded pink salmon, and they are non-porous glazed tiles. Now, at the time, some researchers had been working in converted horse stables. These are wooden spaces that aren't really easy to sanitize or ventilate. And so one of the things researchers are most excited about when they move in is finally being in a space where you can just wipe down the walls. It's the little things in life, I guess. Leo Samuels, who I talked about earlier, and we heard some of his opinions on the governor, was a major researcher and leader in the College of Medicine. And his thoughts on the value of this building are pretty helpful. In a later oral history interview, he remarks that, quote, there was no pressure upon us to devote it entirely to that purpose, and that purpose is cancer research. And he goes on to say, and that was a great help. Otherwise, I don't know what we would have done. We would have certainly lost staff and could have never maintained the program. So as Samuel says it, this building coming in when it does, opening in 1950, is hugely important to faculty at the university for being able to maintain their program of research. Similarly, Thomas Dougherty, the chair of anatomy, also sees this building as particularly valuable. Now, he works closely with that radiobiology annex and the dogs that we mentioned earlier. And so we can see on the back of this photograph is the inscription, and I'll read it out, but it's the photograph on the right. It says, "We chartered scientific horizons, Cancer Research Building, Atomic Energy Commission, or AEC." This image really helps establish what the importance of this building was. The University of Utah had been promising since 1946, 1947 that a large, unified, clean, modern space for research and clinical work would be built on campus. And that still hadn't happened yet. But this building, the MREB, or at the time, Cancer Research Building, was the first step in achieving that goal. More importantly, it's like the most important stopgap. Without this bridge, many faculty would have left the university, and the loss of faculty is exactly what spurred the eventual construction of that big, unified, modern research complex. The medical center, though, doesn't get built and opened, I should say, until 1965. So for 15 years, the Cancer Research Building, which according to Samuels is being used for so many things other than cancer research, is what's keeping the School of Medicine together and actually going. Now, sadly, this building doesn't receive a lot of maintenance care. After 1965, new funding, including the medical center and its successive expansions, are typically prioritized over renovating this building. So it stays the same for much of its existence. But from 1950 to 1965, the Cancer Research Building, or the MREB as we knew it before it was taken down, kept the University of Utah School of Medicine together. If you have more questions or are curious about the history of the health sciences on the University of Utah's campus, be sure to visit the Spencer Eccles Health Sciences Library.